Imagine opening your eyes one morning and realizing that every hardship you've faced, every ache in your body, every moment of mental fog, every breath that feels just a little too hard to take, all comes from one terrible truth. And the worst part, it's not even your fault. You start to piece it together. The shaking in your hands, the tightness in your chest, the confusion that creeps into your thoughts. None of it began with you. It started long before you were born. Your life has been shaped by choices made generations ago. Your parents, obsessed with keeping the family blood pure, made decisions that doomed you. Your mother, she's also your cousin. Your father, he's your uncle, your grandmother. She doubles as your The family tree doesn't grow outward, it wraps around itself, like a suffocating knot. You're not the result of love or destiny. You're the outcome of a plan. A cold, deliberate plan to hold on to power, land, and wealth, no matter the cost. A plan that didn't care about your health, your future, or your right to be whole. This isn't a horror story or a dark piece of fiction. This was real life for countless women throughout history. Women born into families that treated bloodlines like currency and used their own children as pawns in a brutal, generational game. Before we dive into some of these heartbreaking but powerful true stories, stories of strength, survival, and pain, I'd love for you to take a moment and support this channel. If you enjoy exploring the hidden corners of history, hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching or listening from. I always find it amazing to see how far these stories travel. Isn't it something that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different corners of the world, yet connected through our shared curiosity about history? It's a reminder that time and distance mean little when we're united by the desire to understand the past, especially the lives of the women who lived it. To truly grasp their experiences, we first need to face the twisted thinking that caused so much of their suffering. For centuries, European royalty believed that marrying within their own bloodline would protect their right to rule, a right they thought was granted by God. They saw themselves as literally different from ordinary people. Their blue blood wasn't just symbolic. They believed it was purer, holier, and untouchable. This belief was so deeply rooted that by the 16th century, most of Europe's royal families were part of a massive, entangled web, cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, even siblings having children together. They didn't realize, or perhaps didn't want to realize, that they were building a genetic time bomb, one that would explode again and again in the bodies and minds of their descendants. No family represented this better than the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain. They didn't just follow this practice, they mastered it. Their unofficial motto might as well have been, "Let others fight wars. You, happy Austria, marry." But there was nothing happy about it. These weren't love stories. These were cold, strategic unions that produced some of the most physically and emotionally broken rulers in European history. Our first story takes us to Vienna in the year 1634. Behind the heavy walls of the Hofburg Palace, a child is born into a world that will never offer her comfort. Her name is Maria Anna of Austria, and she enters life already marked by the Habsburg curse, a body shaped by generations of inbreeding. From the very start, Maria Anna feels the difference. While other children laugh and run, she can barely take a step without pain. Her spine is curved in such a way that she must hunch forward, and even breathing takes effort. Her jaw juts out so severely that chewing is nearly impossible. The palace servants must slice her food into the tiniest pieces just so she can try to eat. Even then, meals are a challenge. Meals become exhausting rituals, slow, careful, and filled with effort. Every bite must be chewed with precision, every swallow measured and cautious. But, over time, the physical discomfort fades in comparison to something even more painful: the slow, growing realization of why Maria Anna suffers the way she does. Grows up in a palace lined with portraits, the proud, painted faces of her ancestors watching from the walls. And as she studies them, a chilling pattern emerges. One uncle with the same jutting jaw, a grandmother with the same twisted spine, a cousin with a posture that mirrors her own. With each glance, the truth becomes more unbearable. Her body is not a tragic accident. It is part of a legacy of damage passed down through blood. She comes to understand, with a clarity only suffering can bring, that her condition isn't unique. She is just the latest in a long chain of victims, caught in the same web of inbreeding and denial. The palace doctors come and go, draining her blood, murmuring prayers, pretending they don't see what is obvious. They talk in hushed tones about the Habsburg curse, but never when she can hear them. To her face, they call it mysterious. They call it fate. They call it the will of God. But no one ever speaks the truth out loud, that her illness, her pain, her broken body, is the direct result of a family that refused to let fresh blood enter its ranks, a family that put purity above health, image above reality. Maria Anna spends most of her days in shadowed rooms with the curtains drawn, shut away from the public and the public from her. And so, she turns inward. She devours books, and in them, she discovers a world that feels like fantasy. In those pages, people marry for love, not for politics. Children are born with hope, not burdened by the sins of their bloodline. Her mind is sharp, one of the only parts of her body, untouched by the curse, and reading becomes her only escape. But reality always finds its way back in. Doctors continue to examine her regularly. They don't see a person anymore, only a list of symptoms. They record the curve in her spine, the severity of her jaw, the muscle weakness in her limbs. She becomes a medical specimen, a cautionary tale of what happens when you gamble with human genetics. There's no tenderness in their gaze, only clinical curiosity. And then there's the loneliness, which cuts deeper than any physical pain. Suitors, all of them, of course, also her cousins, turn away once they meet her. Marriage proposals appear and vanish in the same breath. Even in a world where cousin marriages are expected, Maria Anna's appearance is too much for anyone to overlook. Her fate is sealed not by choice, but by the condition she was born into. Maria Anna of Austria dies young, at just 32. Her body finally gives up after years of carrying the burden it was never built to bear. The official record lists multiple health issues, but everyone knows the truth, even if they still refuse to say it. But the real cause of Maria Anna's death, it was never written down. Nowhere on her death certificate will you find the words that matter most. She died because generation after generation of her ancestors chose power over humanity, control over compassion, and purity over basic human dignity. From Austria, our story moves to Spain, and to one of the most tragic women in this entire history, Joanna of Castile. Most people know her by the cruel nickname history gave her, Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. She was born in 1479, the daughter of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, the same Catholic monarchs who drove out the Jews and Muslims from Spain, and who sent Christopher Columbus on his voyage across the ocean. Joanna came into the world surrounded by power, and from the start, everyone assumed she was destined for greatness. But what happened instead was something much darker. Joanna became a symbol, a warning of what happens when obsession with bloodlines takes priority over mental health and human love. There was no clear sign of mental illness when she was a child. On the contrary, Joanna was brilliant. She was well educated, spoke multiple languages, and showed a sharp and curious mind. But the danger had already been written into her body, passed down in the DNA of a royal family that had been marrying its own cousins for centuries. Her parents, Isabella and Ferdinand, were cousins. Just like nearly every other ruling couple in Europe at the time. That same tangled family tree that had cursed Maria Anna of Austria was just as present in Spain. The first real cracks appeared after Joanna was married off to Philip of Burgundy, better known as Philip the Handsome. The marriage wasn't about love. It was about politics, strategy, and cementing alliances between powerful houses. But behind the public display, their relationship was toxic. Philip was cold, he was manipulative, he was unfaithful, and Joanna's response wasn't quiet submission. It was fierce, overwhelming, desperate love. She clung to him emotionally with everything she had. To others, it looked like madness. But was it? Was she truly insane? Or was she simply reacting with raw, human emotion to a life that left her no space to breathe? Joanna had been raised to believe her role was clear. Marry well, stay loyal, and produce children to continue the dynasty. That was her purpose. That was her value. And when her marriage turned into a source of daily pain, betrayal, and public shame, something inside her broke. Her mind, already vulnerable from years of inherited trauma, couldn't withstand the pressure. That's when the real tragedy began. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, something inside Joanna shattered. Her grief didn't fade, it deepened, twisted into obsession. She couldn't let go. She refused to bury him. Instead, she traveled across Spain with his coffin, keeping it close. opening it often just to kiss his decaying body. It's a haunting image, almost too disturbing to imagine, but it reveals something raw and painful about her reality. Joanna had lived in such deep emotional isolation, surrounded by power but starved of love, that even death couldn't loosen her grip on the one person who had, at the very least, acknowledged her, no matter how cruel he had been. Her father Ferdinand, and later her own son, Charles V, didn't see her pain, or perhaps they did and used it to their advantage. They claimed she was mad, dangerous, unfit to rule, and with that, they locked her away. For 46 years, Joanna was held in confinement, not in a palace, but in the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The place was bleak and harsh. The rooms were cold and damp. Light barely touched the walls. Food was scarce. Hygiene was almost non-existent. She was treated more like a prisoner than a queen. Reports from her attendants described disturbing scenes. Weeks would pass without her bathing. She ripped her clothes apart in fits of despair. She screamed, sometimes for hours, with no one offering comfort. But we have to ask, was this truly madness, or was it the result of unbearable trauma? More and more, modern historians are rethinking Joanna's story. Many now believe her so-called insanity was not a medical diagnosis, but a political tool, a convenient way to sideline a powerful woman and remove her from the throne. Her mental state, while fragile, may have been more about grief, depression, and long-term psychological damage than true psychosis. In fact, her behaviors, while intense, fit the profile of someone suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. She had been betrayed by her husband, used by her father, and ultimately cast aside by her own son. Add to this a lifetime of isolation, confinement, and emotional abuse, and her breakdown becomes tragically understandable still. Genetics played a role too. Joanna's family history shows unmistakable signs of inherited mental illness, depression, anxiety, emotional instability. These patterns grew worse with every generation of inbreeding. Her great-grandmother had similar mental episodes, and her own daughter, Catherine, would later battle deep, lasting depression. The pattern was there, obvious to anyone who dared to look closely. Joanna died in 1555, still locked away, still labeled mad. By then, the world had forgotten her. Her passing received barely a whisper. She had been pushed out of public life decades earlier, her story reduced to a sad footnote, rather than being remembered as a victim of cruelty and political manipulation. She was dismissed as just another unstable royal woman, inconvenient, embarrassing, and easier to silence than to understand. And now, we move forward to another chapter in this painful legacy, this time in the grand, glittering court of Spain. A little girl named Margaret Teresa enters the story. Born in 1651 with the full weight of the empire resting on her fragile shoulders, she is the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain, and his niece, Mariana of Austria, yes, his niece. By this point, the Habsburg obsession with blood purity had reached such extremes that uncles marrying their own nieces was no longer shocking. It was routine. The family tree didn't just twist anymore, it folded in on itself completely. Margaret Teresa's short life was recorded in rich detail, not in diaries or letters, but in the extraordinary paintings of Diego Velázquez, the official court painter. In his famous portraits, we see a child who should be playing games, laughing, free. Instead, she's dressed like a miniature adult, wrapped in layers of stiff, ceremonial clothing, frozen in position, expected to represent power, even before she learned how to wield it. Look closely at those portraits. Velázquez was a master, too skilled to lie, too loyal to be cruel. He captured what he had to without drawing too much attention to it. In those brushstrokes, you can see the signs. Margaret Teresa's jaw pushes forward slightly, not dramatic yet, but enough to foreshadow the severe deformities that would grow worse with time. Her eyes seem distant, unfocused, a hint at the developmental issues that shadowed her early years. Even her posture, rigid and tilted, suggests the same spinal defects that had haunted so many of her relatives. These were not just quirks or individual features, they were symptoms, physical echoes of a long line of inbreeding, passed down generation after generation. The Spanish court may have looked golden and glamorous on the outside, but within its walls, children like Margaret carried the heavy price of a dynasty obsessed with itself. But the most heartbreaking thing about Margaret Theresa wasn't what could be seen in a painting. The real tragedy in Margaret Theresa's story isn't just her physical condition. It's how little control she ever had over her own life. From the moment she was born, every major decision about her future was made by others, powerful men who didn't see her as a child, a person, or a daughter. To them, she was a symbol, a pawn in a political game. Before she could even speak properly, Margaret was promised in marriage to her uncle Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor. She was still a toddler when the engagement was announced, and it was hailed across Europe as a major diplomatic victory. No one paused to ask what this meant for the little girl at the heart of it all. She grew up knowing exactly what was expected of her: marry her uncle, continue the dynasty, and bear healthy heirs. That was her job. That was her value. Margaret Theresa received the very best education available to women of her class and time. She learned multiple languages, studied music and painting, and mastered the elegant dances of the court. But all of this was for one purpose: to make her a more appealing bride for her uncle and future husband. Her talents were never nurtured for her own sake. They were assets in a political dowry. In 1666, the wedding took place. Margaret Theresa was just 15 years old. Leopold was 26, old enough to be her father, and, in fact, he was her father's brother. The union was celebrated with great fanfare. There were balls, banquets, and parades. But for Margaret, it marked the end of what little girlhood she'd been allowed to enjoy. Now, she was a wife and an empress. The physical and emotional reality of her marriage was never spoken about openly in official records. But the pressure she faced is easy to imagine. Despite her delicate health and young age, she was expected to begin having children right away. The future of the Habsburg dynasty depended on her ability to produce living, healthy heirs. She did conceive several times, but the results were devastating. Her first child, a daughter, survived for only a few months. Her second pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. When Margaret Theresa finally gave birth to a son who survived infancy, there was a wave of relief throughout the Spanish court. The pressure to produce a male heir had been immense, and for a moment, it seemed that she had fulfilled her role. But the celebration didn't last long. It soon became heartbreakingly clear that the child had inherited the full range of genetic problems that had plagued the Habsburg line for generations. Meanwhile, Margaret herself was growing weaker with each pregnancy. Her health, already fragile due to centuries of inbreeding, began to deteriorate rapidly under the physical stress of repeated childbirth. Modern doctors would likely diagnose her with severe anemia, chronic respiratory illness, and possibly epilepsy, conditions that made every day a battle. Court physicians kept detailed records of her decline. They noted her growing difficulty with speech, her frequent seizures, and her inability to digest food properly. But despite all the evidence, they never acknowledged the root of the problem: the irreversible genetic damage caused by generations of marrying within the same bloodline. Margaret Theresa died in 1673, only 6 years after her marriage. She was just 21 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as a fever, but the truth was far more devastating. Her body had simply given out, worn down by a lifetime of inherited defects and the unrelenting demands placed on her as a royal wife and mother. Her death was mourned across the empire. But those mourning weren't grieving the young woman she truly was. They mourned the loss of a vessel, a source of potential heirs, not the tragic loss of a life cut short by a system that treated women like breeding stock to preserve a lineage that was already collapsing under its own genetic weight. Now, we shift scenes to the glittering world of Versailles. Behind the grandeur and elaborate rituals of the French court, another Habsburg princess faces the private costs of her family legacy. Her name is Anna of Austria. Anna was born in 1601, the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, another marriage between an uncle and his niece, considered not just acceptable but ideal by the standards of Europe's ruling dynasties. From early childhood, Anna's life followed an unfamiliar pattern. Her development was noticeably slow. Like many other Habsburg children, she showed early signs of learning difficulties and developmental delays. Her jaw, like so many others in her bloodline, protruded significantly, making it difficult for her to speak clearly or eat with ease. But beyond the physical issues, Anna showed emotional distress from a young age. Today, doctors would likely describe her symptoms as severe anxiety and depression, conditions that made even daily tasks feel overwhelming. At just 14 years old, In 1615, Anna was married off to King Louis XIII of France. The union wasn't about her happiness or her readiness for marriage. It was a political maneuver, meant to end long-standing hostilities between Spain and France. No one paused to think about how this would affect Anna personally. She was pulled from everything. She knew her language, her family, her home, and sent to a foreign land where she was expected to adapt instantly. The French court had its own customs, its own expectations, and no patience for a young girl struggling with fear, homesickness, and the invisible burden of generations of genetic damage. And yet, she was now the Queen of France. At first, the French court greeted Anna of Austria with great fanfare. The halls of Versailles echoed with music, banquets were held in her honor, and the public celebrated the new Queen of France. But behind the smiles and ceremonies, a much harsher reality began to unfold. Her husband, King Louis XIII, was distant and emotionally unavailable. He rarely spoke to Anna, and when he did, the words lacked warmth. He seemed uninterested in her, entirely. Today, many historians believe that Louis suffered from severe depression and may have struggled with same-sex attraction, a reality that was completely forbidden in his time. Whatever the cause, the emotional distance between them was impossible to ignore. Anna was trapped. On one side, she was expected, demanded, to bear sons for the French throne. But on the other, she carried the same fragile genetics as all Habsburg daughters, making healthy pregnancies incredibly difficult. Her first attempts at motherhood ended in heartbreak, multiple miscarriages and newborns who died soon after birth. With each loss, her sense of failure grew deeper. Instead of offering comfort, the court doctors blamed her. Based on the medical ideas of the time, they believed the problem lay within Anna's body, not her husband's, and certainly not in the Habsburg bloodline. They subjected her to cruel and humiliating treatments, bloodletting, forced purges, strict and bizarre diets. They examined her body again and again, looking for so-called defects in her female nature, never realizing or never admitting that the real issue was hereditary. The emotional toll was brutal. Isolated in a foreign land, surrounded by pressure and suspicion, Anna became increasingly withdrawn. Whispers followed her through the palace corridors. Courtiers claimed she was cursed. Some said God disapproved of her Spanish background. Others argued that France needed a new queen. The more the rumors spread, the more alone she became. Over time, her mental health suffered greatly. Anna began to show signs of what modern doctors would recognize as severe agoraphobia. She grew terrified of public appearances, often refusing to leave her chambers for days on end. Her private apartments became her refuge and her prison. Her relationship with Louis deteriorated into cold formality. Each blamed the other for their failure to produce a child. They stopped living together as a true couple, only appearing side by side when the court demanded it. In her loneliness, Anna turned to the church. Prayer became her escape. Over time, she developed a deep, nearly obsessive attachment to Catholic rituals, attending Mass frequently and spending long hours in religious devotion. Then, something happened that no one expected. After 23 years of marriage, Anna of Austria gave birth to a son. Anna's miracle child, a healthy baby boy, would grow up to become Louis XIV, the future Sun King. His birth was hailed as a sign of divine favor. Across France, celebrations broke out, bells rang, prayers were said, and people believed that the monarchy had been blessed at last. For Anna, the moment was a mix of triumph and renewed fear. Yes, she had finally done what everyone demanded of her, delivered a male heir, but she knew exactly what would come next. More pressure, more expectations. She had proven she could produce a son, so now she was expected to do it again. 2 years later, she gave birth to another boy, Felipe, securing the royal succession. For the first time in decades, Anna was no longer living under the constant threat of being cast aside. She had fulfilled her duty. She had given France not one, but 2 sons. But the years of pain, humiliation, and emotional strain had already left deep scars. Her body was weakened. Her spirit never fully recovered. Even as a mother, Anna remained anxious and withdrawn. The joy she might have felt was buried beneath layers of trauma. Her health continued to decline. She suffered from chronic digestive problems, breathing issues, and what court doctors at the time called melancholy fits, long, dark episodes where she would remain in bed for days. Unmeld or unwilling to speak. Modern historians now believe Anna suffered from multiple mental health disorders, including severe depression and anxiety conditions that were common in the Habsburg bloodline and made worse by the trauma of her early marriage and the pressure. She lived under 4 decades. Anna of Austria died in 1666. She had outlived her husband, King Louis XIII, and lived long enough to see her son become one of the most powerful rulers in European history. But her personal legacy is far more sobering than the political victories. It's a legacy of what happens when a system treats women not as individuals, but as tools, valued only for their ability to reproduce. A system that ignored the long-term consequences of dynasty-preserving inbreeding, a system that shattered lives behind the walls of palaces. And this system didn't end with her. Marie Antoinette, remembered by most for her dramatic downfall during the French Revolution, was also a product of the same Habsburg tradition. Born in 1755, she was the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. Their marriage wasn't as close as some earlier Habsburg pairings, but the genetic legacy of centuries of cousin marriages still ran through her veins. When Marie Antoinette arrived in France in 1770, she was just 14 years old. She carried with her not only the weight of an alliance between Austria and France, but also the invisible burden of everything her family lineage had passed down. Marie Antoinette's portraits, especially those painted by Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, have become iconic. They show us a graceful, elegant queen, draped in silk and surrounded by luxury. But look a little closer, and subtle signs of her genetic inheritance begin to show. Her slightly protruding lower lip, the unmistakable outline of the Habsburg jaw, softened by youth but still there, the quiet legacy of centuries of intermarriage within the same royal bloodline. Yet the true challenges Marie faced couldn't be captured on canvas. Like many members of the Habsburg dynasty, she suffered from a series of physical and emotional health problems. Court doctors referred to them vaguely as feminine troubles. Today, we'd likely recognize them as severe menstrual disorders, repeated miscarriages, and hormonal imbalances, conditions that may have been made worse by the genetic fragility passed down through generations of cousin marriages. Her marriage to the future Louis XVI was strained from the very start, though not in the scandalous way that gossips at Versailles imagined. Both Marie Antoinette and Louis carried burdens from their own bloodlines. Louis XVI, by most modern interpretations, showed signs of developmental delay and social anxiety. He was awkward, shy, and emotionally distant, qualities that made intimacy difficult. At the same time, Marie struggled with depression, anxiety, and emotional volatility, traits that had affected many Habsburg women before her. The pressure on them was crushing. They were expected to produce an heir immediately, to seal the alliance between Austria and France with the birth of a royal child. But for 7 years, the marriage remained unconsummated. The rumors were brutal. Whispers of dysfunction, impotence, even scandal spread through the court. Everyone had an opinion. No one had understanding. Marie was subjected to humiliating medical exams. Physicians poked, prodded, and speculated endlessly, trying to determine what was wrong with her. What they never realized, or chose to ignore, was that both she and Louis were likely struggling with a mix of emotional trauma, inherited medical conditions, and psychological damage passed down through generations of dynastic pressure and inbreeding. Eventually, Marie Antoinette did become pregnant. But her troubles didn't end there. Her first pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. She suffered from severe morning sickness, panic attacks, and what modern doctors would recognize as prenatal depression, all while being watched constantly by a court eager for either scandal or success. Her first child, a daughter named Marie Antoinette's first child, a daughter named Marie Therese, was born healthy, a rare moment of joy in her troubled life. But the pregnancies that followed were far more difficult. She suffered multiple miscarriages and lost several infants shortly after birth. Each loss chipped away at her emotional stability, leaving deeper scars that never fully healed. The real heartbreak of Marie Antoinette's story lies not just in her personal suffering, but in how her inherited vulnerabilities collided with one of the most turbulent political moments in European history, the French Revolution. Her anxiety and depression, likely intensified by hormonal imbalances linked to her Habsburg genetics, made it incredibly difficult for her to handle the mounting pressures of royal life during a time of national crisis. Her tendency toward impulsive decisions and emotional reactions, which might have been manageable in a more stable environment, became serious liabilities as France spiraled into chaos. Observers at court began to note changes in her behavior. As tensions in the kingdom rose, she swung between bursts of frantic energy and periods of profound sadness. One moment, she would seem overly confident and involved in decision-making. The next, withdrawn, disconnected, and despairing. These mood shifts were often dismissed as hysteria, but modern historians have suggested they could reflect deeper psychiatric issues, conditions that had long plagued the Habsburg line. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," which she almost certainly never said, became a symbol of how her mental state was weaponized by her enemies. Her emotional fragility, her visible distress, and even her confusion were all twisted into evidence that she was heartless, spoiled, and out of touch with reality. But the truth was far more tragic. Marie Antoinette wasn't indifferent. She was overwhelmed. She had never been taught how to cope with grief, trauma, or political responsibility. Her upbringing had prepared her to smile at banquets, not to face mobs calling for her death. During her final months, held in prison and put on trial, Marie showed a kind of quiet courage, but she also displayed signs of psychological breakdown, dissociative episodes, much like those seen in other Habsburg women under extreme stress. Guards reported moments where she seemed dazed, unable to concentrate during questioning. At times, she simply shut down, not from arrogance, but from sheer emotional exhaustion. Her execution in 1793 was not just the end of a queen, it marked the fall of a dynasty, the final unraveling of a bloodline that had shaped Europe for centuries. In her last moments, she was no longer a symbol of royalty or wealth, but a woman, broken by grief, by genetics, and by a world that had never seen her as fully human. It's said that in her final moments, Marie Antoinette carried herself with quiet dignity, the one trait that had remained with her even as everything else was stripped away. But along with that dignity was a haunting sense of resignation, the kind that comes from someone who had lived through relentless suffering without ever truly understanding why. To fully grasp the scale of the Habsburg genetic tragedy, we can't focus on just a few individuals. We need to look at the devastating impact this dynasty's obsession with blood purity had over generations, especially on the women who were expected not only to survive these conditions but to pass them on. Nowhere is this more painfully clear than in the lives of the Spanish infantas, the royal daughters of late 17th and early 18th century Spain. These girls were the nieces and cousins of Charles II of Spain, the most extreme case of inbreeding in European royal history. Charles II himself was born with such a high inbreeding coefficient, a scientific measure of how genetically similar his parents were that it surpassed even the levels found in children born to direct sibling relationships. He was impotent, suffered from epilepsy, and may have had intellectual disabilities. His birth was the culmination of 16 generations of Habsburg inbreeding. But while Charles II is often the most discussed, it was the girls of the family, his sisters, nieces, and cousins, who may have suffered even more. Why? Because they were still expected to marry and bear children, regardless of how frail or impaired they were. Their lives read less like fairy tales and more like tragic medical records. Maria Margarita, born in 1651, was one such victim. From early childhood, she showed clear signs of severe developmental delays. Official records describe how she couldn't speak clearly until the age of 7. She had difficulty walking, struggled with basic social interaction, and displayed behaviors that modern doctors would likely recognize as consistent with autism spectrum disorder. Despite this, she was still seen as a potential bride, simply because she carried royal blood. Her sister Maria Theresa faced a different but equally tragic fate. She suffered from what court physicians at the time called falling sickness, most likely epilepsy. On top of that, her respiratory system was so weak that even climbing stairs left her breathless. Her jaw was severely misshapen, forcing her to survive on a liquid diet. Her spine was so twisted that she could barely sit or stand without assistance. Maria Theresa's spinal deformity was so severe that she needed help just to sit upright. She, like so many of her relatives, lived out her days inside the Alcazar of Madrid, a royal palace that, by the late 1600s, had come to resemble a medical ward more than a seat of power. Inside those stone walls, Teams of doctors, surgeons, and priests were constantly tending to royal children, all suffering from different symptoms of the same root problem: generations of inbreeding. The palace records from this period read more like a grim medical journal than a royal chronicle. Page after page describes epilepsy, developmental delays, malformed bones, collapsed immune systems, and mental illness. And yet, despite their suffering, these young women were still expected to perform the one role assigned to them by dynastic tradition: produce heirs. Marriage negotiations went forward even when it was clear that these women were too fragile physically and emotionally to bear children. European courts exchanged detailed health reports, not out of compassion or concern, but to evaluate their breeding potential. These daughters of Spain weren't seen as individuals, they were treated like livestock, royal stock, whose value lay entirely in reproduction. Maria Margarita, despite her many impairments, was married off to her cousin, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor, the same man who had once been married to her deceased sister, Margaret Theresa, from the start. The union was doomed. Maria Margarita, mental and developmental difficulties left her unable to fully comprehend her role as a wife. On top of that, her physical condition made consummation nearly impossible. It wasn't a marriage, it was a slow-moving tragedy, carefully documented in the official records but utterly devastating behind closed doors. It's hard to overstate the psychological torment these women endured. From childhood, they were told that their worth depended on their ability to carry and deliver children. But they also lived with the terrifying knowledge that doing so might kill them, and that any children they bore would likely be just as sick, or worse. The private letters from this time are raw with emotion. Royal women wrote to each other about miscarriages, stillbirths, and children born so deformed they couldn't survive outside the womb. Some babies lived a few days, others lasted a few weeks, but most didn't live long enough to be named. The emotional toll was crushing. Many of these women developed what today would be diagnosed as severe anxiety, clinical depression, and post-traumatic stress. They became withdrawn, reluctant to appear in public, ashamed of their bodies, haunted by repeated loss. They blamed themselves for what they saw as failures, their inability to be good wives, good mothers, good queens, even though none of it was their fault. But the word genetics didn't exist back then. They had no way to understand what was truly happening to them, only that they were being asked to do the impossible, over and over, in silence. The science that could have explained what these women were going through simply didn't exist. In their time, genetics wouldn't be understood for centuries. So instead of finding answers, they blamed themselves. Or worse, they believed they were being punished by God. This sense of personal guilt added another layer of suffering to lives already filled with pain, confusion, and isolation. To truly understand what happened to them, we need to look at the genetic facts behind their condition. When close relatives have children, especially when this happens repeatedly over many generations, those children are far more likely to inherit 2 copies of harmful recessive genes. In a genetically diverse population, those defective genes usually get masked by healthy versions passed down from unrelated parents. But when cousins marry cousins, and uncles marry nieces, generation after generation, as the Habsburgs did, those dangerous genes begin to pile up. This is known as inbreeding depression. It doesn't just affect physical traits, it impacts everything from mental health to immune function to the ability to have children. One of the clearest visible signs of this was the so-called Habsburg jaw, what scientists today call mandibular prognathism. It started as a mild trait in the family, but over time, as inbreeding continued, it became much more severe. By the later generations, some Habsburgs couldn't even close their mouths properly. Others couldn't chew solid food at all, but the jawline was only the beginning. Modern genetic studies suggest that members of the Habsburg dynasty likely suffered from high rates of epilepsy, learning disabilities, depression, chronic anxiety, and immune system dysfunctions. Many of the mysterious illnesses that repeatedly affected Habsburg women, constant fatigue, joint pain, unexplained fevers, were probably autoimmune disorders, the result of their increasingly damaged genetic code. Their well-documented fertility problems weren't just bad luck or poor medicine. Inbreeding raises the risk of genetic mismatches that make conception harder and pregnancies riskier. The heartbreakingly common miscarriages and infant deaths weren't merely medical tragedies, they were genetic inevitabilities, the result of centuries of pairing close relatives. And perhaps most devastating of all were the mental health struggles. Women like Joanna of Castile and Marie Antoinette weren't mad in the way their enemies claimed. They were born with a higher risk of depression, anxiety, and emotional instability, vulnerabilities, deeply rooted in their DNA. Then those genetic risks were pushed to the breaking point by trauma, isolation, abuse, and relentless pressure to bear children. Their suffering wasn't a curse. It wasn't a personal weakness. It was biology, a predictable outcome of a system that valued power and bloodlines over health and humanity. The tragedy of these women's lives wasn't just in their suffering, it was in how the system that caused it continued, generation after generation. Despite overwhelming evidence of the harm it was doing, royal courts weren't blind to the consequences of inbreeding. They had detailed medical records documenting the physical deformities, mental health disorders, miscarriages, and infant deaths that plagued their families. Court doctors filed report after report describing these issues in brutal detail. But, instead of treating them as warnings, the ruling elite saw them as medical oddities, unfortunate, but acceptable in the pursuit of political gain. Time and time again, cousin marriages were arranged for diplomatic advantage, even when it was obvious that they were feeding into a growing cycle of biological damage. The connection between inbreeding and declining health couldn't have been clearer. But when forced to choose between human well-being and preserving royal bloodlines, the choice was always the same. Bloodlines came first. The Catholic Church, which had the authority to stop many of these unions, did the opposite. Instead of opposing such close-kin marriages, it issued dispensations, formal approvals, that made even the most dangerous pairings not only legal, but morally and spiritually justified. The Church's stance was rooted in the belief that royal families had been chosen by God, and that preserving the purity of their blood was part of that divine plan. Preventing suffering was secondary, if it was considered at all. Even more painful is the fact that many of the royal women themselves helped keep the system going, raised to believe they were superior because of their lineage. Some actively pursued marriages within their own families. They saw it as a way to protect their heritage, not realizing that they were, in fact, participating in its slow collapse. Perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all is the quiet hope each generation carried that their child would be different, that their baby would be spared the curse. So they kept trying pregnancy after pregnancy, miscarriage after miscarriage, praying that one healthy heir might redeem their suffering. The Habsburg genetic collapse reached its final, irreversible point with the death of Charles II of Spain in 1700. His inbreeding coefficient was one of the highest ever recorded for a European monarch. The result of centuries of repeated cousin and uncle-niece marriages, Charles was physically frail, impotent, and likely suffered from multiple neurological and intellectual disorders. He never fathered children. His death marked not just the end of a royal reign, but the final chapter of a deeply flawed genetic experiment. The death of Charles II of Spain didn't just mark the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, it marked the beginning of a slow awakening. European royalty began to recognize that extreme inbreeding was no longer sustainable. Cousin marriages didn't disappear overnight, but they became less frequent and were often between more distantly related partners. Over time, royal courts started to grasp the genetic risks involved and made adjustments, however gradual. The women whose lives we've examined were not the architects of this system. They were its victims. They suffered not because of any personal weakness or divine punishment, but because their ancestors made choices that prioritized short-term political gain over long-term human health. The pursuit of so-called genetic purity came at the cost of real human lives. But their story doesn't end in darkness. There is something lasting and valuable in what they left behind. Modern science, especially the field of genetics, owes a surprising amount to the painful legacy of the Habsburg dynasty. The tragedies of royal inbreeding gave researchers some of the earliest and clearest evidence of how hereditary diseases develop, how recessive genes function, and why genetic diversity is critical for human survival. While the women of the Habsburg line were reduced to their reproductive role in life, their medical records, their suffering, helped give rise to a deeper understanding of human biology. Even though large-scale royal inbreeding is a thing of the past, the issues it exposed still exist in different ways. In some isolated communities around the world, Cousin marriages are still practiced, sometimes with similar genetic consequences. The tension between honoring tradition and protecting future generations' health is very much alive today. More importantly, these stories remind us of something far beyond genetics. They are a warning about what happens when people, especially women, are seen only as tools for someone else's goals. The Habsburg women weren't treated as full human beings. Their worth was measured by how many male heirs they could produce. Their personal needs, desires, and suffering were considered irrelevant in the grand scheme of royal politics. That kind of dehumanization didn't end with the Habsburgs. In many parts of the world today, women are still reduced to their reproductive capacity, their value judged by how well they serve the needs of family, tradition, or power. The Habsburg story is just one extreme example of a larger, ongoing issue. As we come to the end of these heartbreaking stories, we are left with a difficult truth. These women's suffering had consequences beyond their lifetimes, not the ones their families intended, not stronger empires or lasting dynasties, but knowledge. Their pain, documented so thoroughly in court records and early medical texts, helped build the foundations of modern genetics. That does not justify what was done to them. It does not excuse the system that sacrificed them. But it does mean their pain was not meaningless. Their lives, short, difficult, and often hidden, helped spare future generations from similar fates. They gave us understanding. They gave us warning. Maria Anna of Austria, Joanna of Castile, Margaret Teresa, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, and so many others. They weren't just royal names in history books. They were real women, caught in a system they didn't choose, fighting battles they never should have had to face. And through their stories, we learn not only about the science of heredity, but about the human cost of ignoring it. Teresa of Spain, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, and the forgotten Spanish Infantas. These were not just names in royal family trees. They were real women who lived real lives, full of pain, pressure, and suffering. They weren't just historical side notes or subjects of genetic studies. They were daughters, wives, and mothers. They were human beings, and they deserved far better than the fate handed to them by a system that valued royal blood over human life. Their lives remind us of a vital truth, that human welfare must always come before political strategy, that no matter how powerful the institution, it can cause deep and lasting harm when it forgets the basic dignity of the individual. These stories aren't just about royal history. They are about what happens when people are reduced to their function instead of honored for their humanity. Let's return now to that moment we imagined at the very beginning, the moment of waking up to a horrifying truth, that your entire life has been shaped by decisions made long before you were born, that your pain, your health problems, your isolation, all of it, was caused by ancestors who put their obsession with bloodline purity above the well-being of their own descendants. For the women we've explored, that moment of realization wasn't imaginary. It was their lived experience. They knew, whether it was spoken or not, that their suffering, the curved spines, the difficulty breathing, the anxiety, the miscarriages, the social rejection, came from the same root, a genetic inheritance slowly poisoned by generations of inbreeding. And yet, in all this darkness, there is something powerful. These women, despite everything, found ways to show that they were still human, still thinking, feeling, and worthy of respect. Maria Anna of Austria turned to books, using her brilliant mind to explore a world far larger than the walls of her palace. Joanna of Castile, even in the grip of grief and madness, held on to a fierce, aching love that defied the politics that tried to silence her. Margaret Teresa endured immense physical hardship but carried herself with quiet strength, fulfilling her role with as much dignity as her body would allow. Anna of Austria leaned into her Catholic faith, finding meaning and comfort in prayer when nothing else made sense. Marie Antoinette, in her final days, faced public humiliation, imprisonment, and execution with a courage that few had credited her with in life. Their lives were shaped by decisions beyond their control, but their legacies, their resistance, their inner strength, their very humanity, are what endure. Even in the darkest of circumstances, these women remind us that pain does not erase personhood, that dignity can survive even when everything else is stripped away. And that truly remembering their stories, is not just an act of history, it's an act of justice. The human spirit, even in the worst of circumstances, still finds ways to declare its worth. These women, silenced, controlled, and shaped by forces beyond their control, showed us that truth. But their lives also leave us with a responsibility to learn from their pain, and to make sure that no future pursuit, whether political, economic, or cultural, is ever again allowed to destroy people in the name of ideology. The obsession with keeping bloodlines pure may have ended in royal Europe, at least in its most extreme form, but the memory of these women, and what they endured, lives on. Their suffering is a warning, a reminder of what happens when tradition is chosen over compassion, when power is valued more than love, and when human beings are treated as tools instead of individuals. Their legacy is heartbreaking because everything they endured could have been prevented. But it's also redemptive because their stories helped spark change. Through them, we learned. Science advanced, genetics evolved, and most importantly, society began to understand that nobility is not something passed through bloodlines. It's something proven through how we treat one another. They paid the price that their ancestors refused to acknowledge, the cost of valuing names, alliances, and power above human well-being. And in doing so, they gave us a message that still echoes through time. Remember us, not for our crowns, our titles, or our dynasties. Remember us as people, daughters, wives, mothers, who deserved better than the fate that genetics and politics forced upon us. Remember us, and let our stories teach you, so that no one else has to suffer the way we did, so that the curse of keeping bloodlines pure ends, not just in history, but in memory, and never returns again.